Exercise 6 deals with the classification of tissues. Tissues are a group of cells that will have a similar function and they have a similar structure to them. And then these tissues are going to be organized into organs, which also then have a very particular function. Organs will have at least two different types of tissues comprising them. Histology refers to the study of tissues. When we look at tissues, all tissue can be classified or divided into one of four different types: epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscle. So we'll start with the epithelial tissue. The function, there are several different possible functions: protection, absorption, filtration, excretion, secretion, and sensory reception. Now, not all epithelial tissue will have all of these functions, but it may have one or two of them. Some unique characteristics of epithelial tissue is that there is going to be one membrane that's going to have a free surface. So one side of it has an open free surface to it. That's what we refer to as polarity. The free surface is going to be the apical surface. These will have specialized contacts. It's usually going to be supported by connective tissue. So one side has the free surface, and then opposite that will be connected to or supported by connective tissue, and that's what you call the basement membrane. Epithelial tissue can go through mitosis very quickly and regenerate itself quickly. It is avascular, meaning it does not have a direct blood supply to it, but it does have nerves to it, so we say it's innervated. In terms of classification of the epithelial tissue, how do we classify them? How do we distinguish between different types? We use a naming system, which is going to be looking at the shape of the cell and how many layers it is. So if it's just one layer of cells, it's called simple. If it's two or more layers, it's called stratified. Then if we look at the shape of the cells, it can be either squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. If it's kind of scale, flatten-like, it's squamous. If it's cube-like, it's cuboidal, and if it's rectangular, like a column, it's called columnar. And then we have some additional kind of subcategories, if you will, of this. Pseudostratified. Now remember, stratified means multiple layers. Well, pseudostratified, we see this sometimes with simple columnar, meaning it's one layer of column-shaped cells. But those cells are different heights, so when you have them all lined up next to each other, it actually looks like it's multi-layered. But in reality, it's only one layer. It's just they're not all uniform in the height. So that would be pseudostratified. Oftentimes, pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells are often ciliated, meaning on that free surface, they do have cilia. Transitional epithelial cells, these cells are flat when they're stretched, but when they're not stretched, they're nice and round. So an example of where you would find this is in the urinary bladder, that when that organ is empty, the cells look round, but as it fills and has to stretch, they flatten out kind of like squamous cells. And this is showing just various examples of the epithelial cells in terms of, let's see, excuse me, where you have just a single layer here of the cells. Here you can see the free surface, that is, all of these have a free surface on them. This is what I was telling you, these look like columnar cells, how they look like the long columns. And then certainly here you have multi-layers, so it would be stratified. Epithelial tissue also includes the glandular epithelium. This would be the endocrine and exocrine glands. Endocrine glands are the ductless glands. They secrete hormones. So this is involved with the endocrine system. They do secrete the hormones, which will go into the extracellular fluid and then enter typically into the blood and be transported to their target cell. Exocrine glands do retain their ducts, and they will secrete that material either into a body cavity or on the body surface. So examples would be like your sweat glands, your oil glands, where it secretes them on the oil and the sweat on the surface of the skin. Connective tissue. This is a large category. The function is to protect, support, to also help insulate, and as the name implies, it helps to bind other tissues together. So with the classification of connective tissue, you have what's known as connective tissue proper. You have cartilage, you have bone, which is osseous tissue, and then blood. Blood is classified as a tissue, and it is in the connective tissue category. That connective tissue proper can then be subdivided into loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. The loose connective tissue is further subdivided into the areolar, the adipose, and reticular. You may be familiar with the adipose tissue, that is fat tissue. And then the dense connective tissue is also subdivided into dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic tissue. So as you can see, there's lots of different types of the connective tissue. There is the matrix, this extracellular material between the cells. Oftentimes there may be fibers. As you can see, there's some strands here between the cells. And then here you can see is an example of the adipose tissue. And then your osseous or bone tissue is right here. There is what we call the central canal right here. And then it looks like concentric rings around it. This would be what we call a compact bone. And you just have these layers. Very classic in its shape. And then in the bottom right here, we do have our red blood cells. This is blood sample, most of it's red blood cells. And then these are examples of some of your white blood cells. They do have a nucleus. That's what the darker purple is. The reason you don't see a nucleus with the red blood cells is because the mature ones do not have one. The extracellular matrix this is what I was saying, is produced by the cells of the connective tissue, and then it's excreted out of the cell. So it's extracellular, meaning it's outside the cell. It's going to help provide strength to that connective tissue. It may be composed of two different substances: the ground substance, which is a combination of various proteins and proteoglycans and interstitial fluid, and then the fibers. Fibers are helping to provide the support. It could be collagen fibers, elastic fibers, or reticular fibers. So you're going to look at that matrix to help you determine specifically what type of connective tissue it is. To distinguish between visually by looking at the connective tissue as well as the epithelial and the nervous and muscular, it just takes practice. So it's something that you need to make sure that you look at the slides, whether you are in a lab and have access to a microscope and slides, practice looking at those histology slides. And if you're taking class online, certainly there's a wealth of information online to be able to look at various examples of these as well, so you can identify them. Nervous tissue. The function here is to receive a stimuli and then generate an electrical impulse. Now we have two different types of nervous tissue. You have the neuroglial, sometimes just called the glial cells. These are the supporting cells that will help to protect and support and insulate the neurons, which is the second type. The neuron is the cell that actually receives that electrical impulse and then can generate it and pass it on to another cell. And so you can see in this diagram right here, this is part of the neuron here. This is kind of a classic picture showing the cell body. And here is an axon where the electrical impulse is going to be coming here and be generated and moved down this way. Right there in the middle, I just went over, was the nucleus. And these smaller little dots over here are some of those supporting cells. And in this picture as well, you can see here is the neuron cell body. Here is another one, and another one over here. For the muscle tissue, so you've had your epithelial, your connective, your nervous, and now the fourth type is the muscle tissue. Its function is to contract so that you allow movement of the organism. There are three different types of muscle tissue. You have your skeletal muscle, your smooth muscle, and your cardiac muscle. Skeletal muscle is under voluntary control. So you can say, I want to walk over here and grab a drink. I want to sit down. You can control that. Both the smooth and the cardiac muscle are under involuntary control. You have absolutely no control over the rate at which the contraction is going to take place, or if it does take place. Skeletal muscle, the cells tend to be very long. They're cylindrical. They are not branching. They are striated, meaning they have, when you look at it microscopically, they have stripes to them. And they are multinucleated, so they have more than one nucleus per cell. Smooth muscle is spindle-shaped and it's only uninucleated. It is not striated. And cardiac muscle is branched. It is striated. It's uninucleated. It does contain what we call intercalated disc. So this picture shows the three different types of muscles. So how would you distinguish between them? Personally, I find one of the easiest ways is to look for the striations. Look for the striping pattern. How you can see those stripes there. If it is striped, that means it is skeletal or cardiac. Over in this diagram, there is no striations to it, so it has to be smooth muscle. So this indeed over here is the smooth muscle. So how are you going to distinguish between skeletal and cardiac? Cardiac muscle, there's not branching. Notice on the skeletal, this is skeletal muscle down here. Notice how you've got all this different branching that's going on. That would be one clue that this is cardiac muscle because of the branching. Skeletal muscle, once again, is not branching. They tend to lie right on top of each other. Notice that you have more than one nucleus per cell with the skeletal muscle. However, with cardiac muscle, there is only one nucleus per cell. The other big clue besides the branching, notice right here, these lines right here that I'm highlighting, those are what we call intercalated disc. It's a special, unique thing on cardiac muscle that is seen. It's going to be involved to allow the muscle to contract as a single unit, even though you have thousands of cells. These intercalated discs are seen only with cardiac muscle. So when you look at the cells, number one, a neuron is very unique in its branching shape and the fibers. Muscle itself is also kind of unique in the structure. It has that. If it's skeletal or cardiac, it's going to have the striations. Look for the intercalated disc. That tells you it's cardiac. Epithelial tissue always has one free surface on it. And like I said, it's like anything else. Just practice, whether in the lab in person, as I said, and looking at the various samples, or as you are very familiar, there's a wealth of knowledge online, multiple sites you can go to look at histology slides to help you to be able to identify the various types. So you need to be able to identify into first those four broad categories of epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscle. And then you need to be able to subdivide the three different types of muscle, the various types of epithelial, nerves, you basically can identify the neuron, and then connective tissue, you have all the various types that you need to be able to distinguish between.